My dear friends, before we start, I asked you all to press a like and leave your comment. This will help a lot to promote this video and to release news stories as soon as possible. It's not hard for you, but it's a pleasure for me. Thank you. I've always been drawn to mysteries. The inexplicable, the strange occurrences that people write off as coincidences or imagination. Some might call it morbid curiosity. I like to think of it as trying to see beyond the veil of everyday life. Little did I know that my thirst for something unusual would take me to a place I still can't fully explain. It all started about 5 years ago. My name is Emma Hill, and at the time, I was working a soul-draining job across town. You know the kind that drags your spirit, but you convince yourself it's a necessity. The day began as an ordinary Tuesday, but I had no idea it would end in the most unnerving experience of my life. That morning, my mood was lifted by something as trivial as new boots. I had just bought them, black, towering platform boots with intricate laces and metallic accents that made me feel a bit like a warrior queen. The moment I slipped them on, I knew I was making a bold statement. As I strutted into work, I noticed the disapproving glances from the women in the accounting department. Their faces scrunched up in quiet judgment. They were draped in their usual beige attire and dull loafers, while I walked past with a smile that practically screamed, "I don't care." The joy was short-lived. After a few hours on my feet, the novelty of my boots wore off, leaving me with aching feet and the kind of blisters that make you wonder if beauty is really worth the pain. By the end of the workday, I was hobbling like a wounded animal. My feet felt like they had been through a meat grinder. After work, I declined an invitation to a small office banquet. There was no way I could stand for another minute, let alone socialize. My only goal was to make it home, rip off those infernal boots, and collapse into bed. But fate had other plans. As I approached the bus stop, my stomach dropped. I reached into my bag for my wallet and phone, both missing. In my rush to match my boots to the perfect purse, I had left them in my other bag at home. Fantastic. I was broke and stranded on the opposite side of town, with no direct buses running at that hour. My only option was to walk home. A little voice in my head told me to take the long way home, avoiding the park, which had gained a reputation for shady characters. But my feet were on fire, and my patience was thin. A shortcut through the park seemed like the lesser of two evils. So I hobbled along the darkened path, tried to ignore the distant sounds of city life slowly fading behind me. The park, known as Greenbelt, had always been eerie after dark. Old, gnarled trees towered overhead like ancient sentinels, and the gravel path crunched beneath my boots. But it wasn't the trees or the darkness that unsettled me. It was the bats. The first time I saw one dart overhead, I was only mildly spooked. Bats were nothing new to me, and I'd always found them fascinating. But as I trudged further into the park, more bats appeared, swirling in chaotic patterns above me. I paused and looked up. That's when I noticed something peculiar. The bats weren't just flying aimlessly. They were forming a circle, a perfect spinning circle, directly above me. I froze. The circle of bats seemed to descend, spiraling tighter and tighter as they closed in. A soft rustling filled the air, the sound of hundreds of wings fluttering in sync. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I considered running. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. The air was thick, almost electric, as if the entire park had been swallowed by a presence I couldn't see. Then I heard it, a voice low, gravelly, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint murmur. But as the bats drew closer, the voice became distinct, tangible. "You belong here, with US." I spun around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. There was no one, but the voice persisted, echoing in the stillness of the night. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine. The bats were so close now that I could feel the rush of air from their wings against my face. "Come closer," The voice beckoned. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but then something strange happened. The pain in my feet gone, the exhaustion that had weighed me down all day vanished. I felt light, almost euphoric. My fear dulled, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. And then I saw him. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. His skin was a mottled shade of ash, blending eerily with the shadows. He was tall, towering, even with long, spindly limbs that seemed to move with unnatural fluidity. But it was his head that sent a jolt of terror through me. Instead of a human face, he had animal bone skull. Bone Claw, I realized the creature of urban legend. I had heard rumors about this creature, whispers in dark corners of the internet. But seeing him up close was something else entirely. His presence was suffocating, as if he was draining the very air from the park. "Emma," the voice came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from Bone Claw's skull. It was inside my head, worming its way into my thoughts. "Why are you running? You've always been looking for something, haven't you?" I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place. The bats swirled faster around me, the circle tightening again. Bone Claw stepped closer, his long arms reaching out as if to touch me. "You belong here, with us, in the circle." In that moment, I realized what was happening. The bats, the circle, it wasn't just a natural occurrence. This was a ritual, a summoning, and I was the target. Bone Claw wasn't alone. There were others, creatures I couldn't see, lurking just beyond the edge of the circle, waiting for me to fall. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from the paralysis and bolted. My legs moved faster than they ever had before, and I sprinted down the path, my boots thudding against the gravel. I didn't dare look back. The sound of wings filled the air, but I kept running, pushing myself beyond the limits of exhaustion. When I finally burst out of the park and into the safety of the streetlights, the sound stopped. The bats were gone, Bone Claw was gone, but the fear that stayed with me. I never wore those boots again. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, that the exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. Greenbelt was more than just a park. It was a gateway, one that I had narrowly escaped. I don't go near the park anymore, and every time I hear the distant bats squeak, I can't help but wonder if he's still waiting for me, lurking in the shadows, calling me back to the circle of bats. Life after that night was far from normal. Days passed, but the events at Greenbelt clung to me like a cold, wet blanket. I tried telling myself it was over, but my body betrayed me every time I heard an unfamiliar sound. A loud honk from a car made me jump. The sudden blare of a fire alarm in my building sent me into a panic, scrambling for the exits as if Bone Claw was right behind me again. Sleep became a rare commodity. When I closed my eyes, I saw the bats, their tiny forms fluttering just inches away from my face. Worse than that, I saw him, his ash skin and those unearthly bones, which in my dreams weren't just silent hums but full-blown alarms, screeching in my ears until I jolted awake. Night after night, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, terrified that he was out there, waiting to finish what he had started. But Bone Claw didn't appear in the way I thought he would. No, his terror was quieter, more insidious. It crept into my everyday life in ways that were impossible to ignore. Random electrical malfunctions became the norm around me. Lights flickered and went out every time I entered a room, and my phone's battery drained mysteriously overnight, despite being on the charger. The feeling of being watched followed me everywhere. At work, on the subway, even at the grocery store. And sometimes, when I was alone in my apartment, I could hear a faint sound outside the window. It wasn't clear, just a low squeak, but I knew it was him. One night, about 2 weeks after the encounter at Greenbelt, I heard it again, the hum, this time more insistent. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere in the distance, and it was growing louder. I rushed to the window and peered out into the empty street below. Nothing, but the squeak persisted, and soon it became unmistakable. I slammed the window shut, grabbed my phone, and dialed the only person I could think of who might believe me. Sophie, the one person who knew about my obsession with the supernatural. "Sophie, it's happening again." I whispered into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emma, slow down," Sophie replied, her voice groggy with sleep. "What's happening again?" "Boneclaw. I think he's outside my apartment." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "You know that's just a legend, right? You're probably just..." "No!" I cut her off, my voice cracking. "Sophie, I'm serious. I saw him. I've been seeing things ever since that night in Greenbelt. The bats, the sounds, the lights, everything's been off. You have to believe me." Another pause, this time longer. Finally, Sophie's voice softened. "Okay, I believe you. But what do you want me to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. I need you here. Please." "All right," she said with a sigh. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just try to stay calm, okay?" I hung up the phone and sat down on the edge of my bed, trying to steady my breathing. The bat squeak outside had faded, but the uneasy feeling in my chest remained. I glanced around my apartment, half expecting Boneclaw to materialize from the shadows, but the room was still. Exactly 20 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. I rushed over and opened it to find Sophie standing there, looking concerned, but also slightly amused. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping inside. I managed a weak smile. "Thanks for coming." We sat down in the living room, and I recounted everything that had happened since that night. Sophie listened patiently, her skepticism gradually fading as I described the strange occurrences in vivid detail. By the time I finished, she looked more worried than amused. "So, what are we supposed to do now?" Sophie asked, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "If this thing is real, then what does it want?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I think it's connected to that park, Greenbelt. That's where it all started." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You want to go back there? Don't you?" The thought had been nagging at me for days, but I hadn't said it out loud until now. As much as the idea terrified me, I knew Sophie was right. Something in that park had triggered all of this, and if I wanted it to stop, I had to go back. "Yeah," I admitted. "I think I have to." Sophie sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "Well, I'm not letting you go alone. We'll go together." We planned our return to Greenbelt for the following night. Sophie brought along her younger brother, Alan, who had always been the adventurous type and wasn't about to let us go into a potentially haunted park without him. Alan was 23, and though he had never shared my obsession with the supernatural, he was fascinated by the idea of urban legends and was more than eager to join us. We arrived at the park just after sunset. The air was cool, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The entrance to Greenbelt felt different this time, more ominous, as if the park itself had become a living thing, waiting to swallow us whole. "You sure about this?" Alan asked as we stood at the edge of the path. "Not at all," I replied honestly, "but I don't think I have a choice." With that, we stepped onto the gravel path and began our journey back to the spot where it all began. The park was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees above. As we walked, I kept my eyes trained on the sky, half expecting to see the bats return. "You think we'll see Boneclaw again?" Sophie asked, her voice low. "I hope not," I muttered, but deep down, I knew that's exactly what would happen. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the clearing where I had first encountered Boneclaw. The air here was heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something unnatural. I could feel my pulse quicken, my palms growing clammy as I scanned the area for any sign of movement. "Do you see anything?" Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, but I feel something. Suddenly, the temperature dropped and a familiar sound filled the air. The soft squeak. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The squeak grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw them, the bats. Just like before, they appeared out of nowhere, swirling in a perfect circle above us. But this time, the circle was larger, encompassing all three of us as it spiraled tighter and tighter. Emma, Sophie's voice was panicked. What's happening? I don't know, I shouted over the growing noise. Just stay close. The squeak intensified, and the bats descended, their wings beating against the air with frantic energy. And then, out of the darkness, he appeared, Boneclaw. His towering figure loomed over us, his bones glowing faintly in the dim light. The sound he emitted was deafening now, a pulsating wail that reverberated through my skull, making it hard to think. Emma, the voice was back, louder this time, echoing inside my head. You came back? You belong here in the circle? No, I screamed, backing away. I don't belong here. Boneclaw's long, spindly arms reached out, as if to pull me into the circle. I could feel the pressure building, the overwhelming sense of doom closing in around me. It's too late, the voice whispered. You've already chosen. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew I couldn't let it take me. Not again. Rot! I shouted to Sophie and Alan, grabbing them by the arms and dragging them toward the path. But the circle of bats blocked our way, their wings creating a barrier that seemed impossible to breach. We're trapped, Sophie cried, her eyes wide with terror. I looked around frantically, searching for a way out. The squeak was so loud now that it was almost unbearable, my ears ringing with the intensity of it. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a break in the circle, a small gap in the swarm of bats. There, I pointed. We can make it. Without hesitation, we sprinted toward the gap, the bats closing in around us as we ran. My legs burned with the effort, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop. We had to make it out. Just as we reached the edge of the circle, the wail reached a fever pitch, and for a moment, I thought we wouldn't make it. But then, with a final burst of energy, we broke through the barrier of bats and tumbled onto the path. The squeak cut off abruptly, and the park fell silent once more. I lay on the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling with adrenaline. When I finally looked up, Boneclaw was gone, and the bats had vanished into the night. Sophie and Alan were beside me, equally shaken but alive. We made it. Alan panted, his eyes wide with disbelief. We actually made it. But as I sat there, staring up at the empty sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Even though we had escaped the park, Boneclaw's shadow still loomed large over us. I wish I could say that leaving Greenbelt lifted the weight from my chest, but the truth was far more unsettling. The drive back was silent. The three of us too shaken to talk, each lost in our own thoughts. Sophie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she stared at the road ahead. Alan, in the back seat, stared out the window, though his eyes weren't focused on anything outside. He was somewhere else, just like I was. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, the way it had echoed inside my head, calling my name, telling me I had already chosen. What had I chosen? And why did Boneclaw want me? I hadn't done anything to provoke it. Had I? It wasn't until we pulled up outside my apartment that Sophie finally spoke. Emma, she said quietly, her voice cracking just a little. What are we supposed to do now? I glanced at her, trying to find the right words. I don't know, I admitted. But we can't go back to the park. Not ever again. Alan, still looking out the window, sighed. Yeah, but what if it doesn't matter? What if it's already too late? That thing, whatever it is, it knows where we are now. It came after you in your apartment, didn't it? A chill ran down my spine at the memory of the low squeak outside my window. Alan was right. I thought we could outrun it, that maybe the nightmare would stay confined to Greenbelt. But it was foolish to believe that. Boneclaw wasn't bound by the park. He wasn't just some local legend tied to a haunted stretch of trees. He was out there, everywhere. "Look," Sophie said, turning to face me. "You said this all started after we won a Greenbelt, right? There has to be something in that place that's connecting you to him. Something you did, something you touched. I don't know, but I think you're tied to it now." I bit my lip, unsure. Sophie was always the logical one. The person who tried to make sense of things, even when they defied explanation. But this wasn't something logic could untangle. Still, I couldn't ignore what she was saying. What if there was something deeper, something more personal, that Boneclaw was after? That thought terrified me more than anything else. Alan shifted in his seat. "So, we just wait and hope it doesn't come after us again? That's the plan?" Sophie frowned. "We can't just wait. We have to figure out why it's after you, Emma. If we don't, this will never stop." I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. The idea of going back into the horror we had just fled from made my skin crawl. But Sophie was right. We couldn't keep running forever. Whatever had linked me to Boneclaw wouldn't break on its own. We had to face it again. "I'll start looking into it," Sophie said, her voice resolute. "There's got to be something in the town's history, something about Greenbelt that can explain all of this." Alan, meanwhile, tapped away on his phone. "There's no way we're the first people to run into this thing. I'm gonna check some forums. Maybe someone else has had an encounter and can tell us how to stop it. I'll just try to keep breathing." I muttered, half joking but mostly serious. Sophie chuckled, though there wasn't any real humor in her voice. She was scared too, and she wasn't the kind of person who got scared easily. None of us were. After a quick round of goodbyes, Sophie and Alan left, promising to call me as soon as they found anything useful. I was grateful for their support, but the moment the door clicked shut behind them, a wave of dread washed over me. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. The weight of Boneclaw's presence seemed to linger, even though I knew he wasn't there. At least, not yet. I stood in the center of my living room, hugging myself, as if that would somehow protect me from the invisible danger lurking just beyond the walls. Every little sound made me flinch. The creak of the floorboards, the squeak of the refrigerator, the distant honk of a car horn. My nerves were shot, my mind running wild with the possibility that Boneclaw could appear at any moment. Hours passed like this, me pacing the length of my apartment, jumping at shadows, checking the windows and doors over and over again. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that terrible squeak, saw the bats circling above me, felt the cold, inhuman touch of Boneclaw's presence. When dawn finally broke, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but too wired to sleep. My phone buzzed beside me, and I snatched it up, hoping it was Sophie with some answers. But it was Alan, and his message made my heart skip a beat. "Found something. Not good. Meet me at the diner. Bring Sophie." By the time I arrived at the diner, Alan was already seated in the far corner, nursing a cup of coffee and looking more rattled than I'd ever seen him. Sophie was running late, so I slid into the booth across from him, my anxiety spiking at the grim expression on his face. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alan glanced around, as if checking to make sure we weren't being watched, then leaned forward. "I went deep into the forums last night, Emma. Deeper than I've ever gone. There's some really messed up stuff out there. But I found a thread, an old one like years old, about Boneclaw. I felt my pulse quicken, and Alan took a deep breath. There were other people like you, people who encountered him. Most of them didn't make it." My stomach churned. "What do you mean, didn't make it?" "I mean, they disappeared," Alan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "One day, they're posting about how Boneclaw is stalking them, messing with their lives. The next day, nothing. Their accounts go silent. No one hears from them again." I stared at him, my mouth dry. You think that's gonna happen to me?" Alan didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. I leaned back in the booth, trying to process what he was telling me. This wasn't just a nightmare that would go away if I ignored it long enough. Boneclaw was real, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. But what did he want? Emma, I don't know how to say this, Alan began, his voice hesitant. But the thread, there was this one user who posted something that freaked me out. He said that Boneclaw doesn't just choose people at random. He's drawn to something inside them. I frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Alan met my eyes, his expression deadly serious. It's not about where you go or what you do, Emma. It's about what's in your head. Boneclaw finds people who have a connection to him. People who are haunted by something they can't shake. And he uses that. He feeds on it. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Well, what do you mean? Think about it, Alan urged, leaning forward. What were you feeling when you first saw him? What's been going on in your life? There's something inside you that's drawing him to you. You have to figure out what it is, or you'll never escape him. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to push back against the idea, but deep down, I knew he was right. Boneclaw wasn't just some random monster lurking in the woods. He had chosen me for a reason, and that reason was something I couldn't ignore any longer. That night, back in my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, my knees pulled to my chest. Alan's words echoed in my head, and I forced myself to confront the truth I had been avoiding. What had been haunting me? What was it that Boneclaw had sensed in me? I'd always been good at hiding things. I smiled when people asked how I was doing, told them I was fine even when I wasn't. But inside, I had been carrying something heavy, something I didn't let anyone see. Not even Sophie, not even Alan. Fear. Not the fear of monsters or ghosts, but the kind of fear that gnaws at you from the inside. The fear of being alone, of not being good enough, of failing, of disappointing the people I cared about. That fear had been with me for as long as I could remember, lurking in the background of my life, waiting for moments of weakness to pounce. And Boneclaw, he had seen it. He had sensed the cracks in my armor, the vulnerability I tried so hard to hide. That's why he had come after me. I had thought the battle was with him, but the real battle was with myself. As I sat there, the room dark and silent around me, I realized what I had to do. I couldn't just keep running from Boneclaw or from my own fear. I had to face it, confront it head on, or it would consume me. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to Sophie and Alan. We need to talk. Tomorrow morning. Then, for the first time in days, I allowed myself to close my eyes and sleep.